Funding for this Frontline special is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by the financial support of viewers like you.
If I think back, what I would remember most is fear. I can't remember a time when I didn't feel afraid.
She seemed very outgoing. She seemed, of all of the children, probably the best adjusted. I mean, she always just seemed like a normal, happy kid to me.
And I just lie there curled up in a ball and cry and cry and cry. And I stay there for a while. And I feel safe there. I know he's not going to follow me, and I feel safe.
We had almost an ideal American dream, if you will. 3 wonderful daughters, beautiful wife. Our kids were very happy.
I want someone to hear me so badly, but she told me that no one would believe me and that no one would ever love me again.
Well, I was sitting at home in my family room. I had my son in my lap where I was giving him a bottle, and my daughter was playing on the floor below me with some of her friends, coloring books. And my daughter asked me something, and when I looked down and met her eyes, somehow the light behind it or the shade of my daughter's eyes or something just triggered this feeling of terror in me.
In California, Eileen Franklin says just one look from her 6-year-old daughter jarred a memory so terrible she repressed it for 20 years.
All right, listen to this one. Meet Eileen Franklin. Eileen Franklin was the center of a very important landmark case.
The murder she witnessed happened 20 years ago, and the murderer was her father. Reporters literally fell over each other.
The story Eileen Franklin told in court in 1990 happened when she was a child.
The way I remember it is that I was 8 years old, and I was in my father's Volkswagen van with him. And we drove around the corner from my house, and I saw Susan playing outside. And I got really excited, and I asked my dad if Susan could get in the van with us. And so we stopped, and Susan got in. And in the back of the van, there was a bed. And Susan and I were bouncing up and down on the bed, and my dad drove us out to an area that's wooded. And he pulled over to the side of the road, and Susan and I were playing on the bed, and he came back into the back, and I went up into the front, and when I looked back, he had Susan's arms pinned above her head, and he was on top of her, and he was moving back and forth on her, and then I curled up in a ball on the floor and made myself invisible, which is what I used to do as a kid. And afterwards, I remember my dad being out of the van, and that I looked down and I saw Susan sitting below me, and she was sitting on a rock with her knees up, and my father was approaching her with his arms above his head and a rock in his hands. And I believe that I screamed, because Susan looked up at me and then looked at my father, and she brought her hands up to her head, and I heard the rock come down twice on her. I didn't know that it was humanly possible for a person to have a memory come back after 20 years of something.
The memories which Eileen claimed she had recalled were of her best friend, Susan Mason, who had disappeared from her home in Foster City, California in September 1969. 10 weeks later, her body was found in a ravine outside the town. Her death had been caused by blows to her head. The murderer was never apprehended. Eileen's repressed and now newly recovered memories created a media sensation.
Why did she wait 20 years to report it? She had repressed it.
So why is it that some people can remember beginning at an age when you do remember things, 7, 8, 9, and other people absolutely do not?
In psychiatry, we call these things dissociation, which is to separate yourself from what's going on, to feel unreal.
Dr. Lenore Terr, a psychiatrist and expert witness for the prosecution, explained on television what she presented to the jury. A theory of repressed memory that would be further popularized in a television movie about the case.
Do you know what that would cost her?
This whole case depends on proving repressed memory. According to Dr. Terr, traumatic repression is substantiated by repeated violence in childhood.
But in order to fit Dr. Terr's theory that repressed memories involved repeated violence in childhood, Eileen had to come up with other violent experiences that she had repressed.
And then my father held me down on this table.
She recalled repressed memories of sexual abuse by her father. At least she said so. In the movie, in therapy, in the trial, and she continues to say so today.
I had to do a lot of work to acknowledge the memories as being real. And I've tried pushing them away, I've tried denying them, I've tried ignoring them, and they don't go away, they're still there. And I've gotten to the point that I realize there's no sense in denying them.
Dr. Elizabeth Loftus, a memory expert who does not believe in the phenomenon of repressed and then recalled memories, testified for the defense.
Eileen's memory, while richly detailed, contained no information that wasn't part of the public domain, widely publicized. So it was in the public domain that little Susie was hit on the head twice with a rock, and that her ring was crushed, and there was a mattress or a box spring found near her body, and those kinds of details, a matter of public knowledge. And other facts in Eileen's story, uncheckable.
Dr. David Spiegel, who believes in the concept of repressed and recovered memories, also testified for the defense.
What I told the court was that I thought it was possible that she could have, witnessed it and then dissociated or repressed the memory. But that several things made me concerned about the credibility of her recollection. The first is that dissociated memories are out of sight, but they're not out of mind. So even if you can't consciously remember it, there should be some evidence, if you had this memory, of its influence. And yet there was very little that changed in her behavior subsequent to the loss of her friend, in her relationship with her father. She took long trips with him. She rode in the same van in which the girl was initially attacked, according to her subsequent recollection. Secondly, we know that she lied subsequently. She initially said that this recollection came to her in a flash when she was hypnotized by a therapist. She then had a talk with her mother, who had become an attorney, and changed her story. She then said, well, I was looking in my daughter's eyes, and my daughter was the same age as little Susan, and then memory came to me. So either she was lying then or she's lying now about what happened, but it always worries you about a witness when you can document that they were falsifying information.
I was really scared. I didn't know anything about repressed memories. I knew less than nothing about it. And when I told my brother what I had remembered, he looked shocked and he backed away from me. And I panicked and I said, well, what if I told you that I got the memories back as a result of hypnosis? And then he completely accepted it. And he said, oh, well, then that makes sense, and that hypnosis is like peeling away layers of an onion. And so he then accepted that it had happened. But in truth, I hadn't been hypnotized, but I didn't know how to explain where these memories came from. So yeah, I told him I lied to my brother, and what I was trying to do was find a way to deal with the truth.
Whatever the truth was, based on Eileen's memories alone, with no corroborating evidence, the jury found George Franklin guilty of the murder of Susan Mason. He was sentenced to life in prison. The verdict shocked experts in the field of memory research. Dr. James McGaugh is the director of the Center for the Neurobiology of Learning and Memory at the University of California.
Through experiments, we have shown that in general, there is a direct relationship between the degree of emotionality of an experience and the strength of the memory at a later time. Strongly emotional experiences lead to strong memories at a later time. The post-traumatic stress syndrome shows that very strong experiences, traumatic experiences, leave very, very strong memories. Those are verified. Those are validated, that relationship. Now what we're missing for the verification or the validation is evidence to support the claim that a traumatic experience occurs, but it's unavailable, and then later on it is recovered. And I don't know of any evidence from that. Trust me, will not do it.
Dr. Laura Brown, a psychologist and clinician in Seattle, Washington, claims that traumatic memories buried and then retrieved are hardly unusual and should be taken seriously.
I think that when you have observed someone, when someone has sat across from you and they're remembering these things, it changes your understanding of this thing of memory and the recovery of trauma memory.
Why do you think that that's why you were married to a guy who never did anything to this?
Lots of people remember things that no one can corroborate. Lots of things happen. You know, it's the old thing, if the tree falls in the forest and no one's there, does it make a sound? Yeah, it's made a sound. No one was there to hear it. If we don't know, if there was no witness, does it mean that it didn't occur?
In the debate about memory, the central mystery is, what does our mind do with traumatic experiences that happened a long time ago?
Was born after I'd been married 6 years. My son was born approximately a year and a half later. We were living in Hawaii at the time. When my daughter was 5 years old, I found out that her father had sexually molested her. Some friends were staying in a hotel at Waikiki. They invited us down to the beach to spend a Sunday afternoon with them. When it came time to leave, we all went up to our friend's hotel room. We all changed and got ready to leave. I was the first one ready, and my son was ready to leave, so I said, I'll go down and bring the car around to the front. By this time, our friends were down, but my husband and my daughter were not yet down. So we waited, and we waited quite a while, several minutes, 10, maybe 15 minutes. And eventually they came down. Got in the car, we drove off to the airport, dropped the friends off, went home. And it bothered me, it nagged at me that they had been so late. I was a little annoyed at my husband for taking so much time and risking missing our friend's plane. The next day it was still nagging at me, and I asked my daughter, what were you and Daddy doing up in that room so long? And she said, I was putting my mouth where Daddy goes wee-wee. My first reaction was I was horrified. I was stunned. I believed her. I knew that she wasn't making this up. But I was afraid that if I let her see how upset I was, that she would think she had done something wrong, that she would feel guilty somehow. So I didn't pursue this. I just changed the subject and didn't talk to her about it. I didn't question her any further.
That evening, she confronted her husband. He admitted what he'd done and asked for psychiatric help. The incident was never again discussed with the child.
I believed at the time if this horrible incident could just fade out of her memory and go away, that it wouldn't hurt her.
But Jane grew up a troubled young woman. She was in therapy in high school and again in college.
In 2 years of therapy in high school, my therapist worked with me on giving me confidence. The therapy I started as an adult went on for 6 years. Now, this therapist did ask me if anything ever happened with our family, but she never said anything specific about were you sexually abused by a family member. She tried every which way to try and break this wall of not remembering. I had no recollection at all of being abused.
I knew that she didn't remember. And I became convinced that she needed to know this, but before I told her, I consulted the therapist that she had seen in her teens. I made an appointment with him, and I told him the whole story. I said, "Does she need to know this?" And he said, "Yes, she does." And he gave me advice on how to tell her.
She said she wanted to fly down and tell me something in person. I was worried she had cancer or something. And she assured me it wasn't a health issue. And she flew down and told me, and it just all fit together. I immediately could remember what she was telling me. It was just a wave of memories.
Were you shocked?
No, you know, it was the kind of thing where you have such a strong hunch that something's going on, that as soon as you hear what it is, you say, of course, yeah. And it all fit. Everything fit when she told me.
Do you think that you would have remembered if your mother didn't tell you?
I think I was real close. I think it would have taken another year or two to remember.
Would she have remembered what happened to her as a child if she were not told? No one knows. What exactly she remembers now is not clear. But whatever she now remembers, she says, helped her make sense of all the things that didn't make sense before. And it helped her heal.
It all made sense. I had a reason that I always knew I had, but never, you know, as a 4-year-old and a 5-year-old and a 6-year-old, didn't know what all was going on. Everything came together for me. I felt like a whole person for the first time.
There are many young women, troubled and depressed, who are looking for answers to their unhappiness.
I was a mess.
I couldn't work. I had depression so badly that I was in bed most of the day. I would go into rages, at the drop of the hat, drop of a pin. I would just go into a rage. My emotions were very extreme. And so I just assumed that it must have been something very severe that happened to me to make me hurt so much.
I began to have these horrible panic attacks that just seemed to come out of the blue. I felt the desperation that I'd always felt, only magnified about 1,000 times. And I was in therapy. I think I've been in therapy on and off almost most of my life. But I was seeing, the school counselors, and they were helping, but it wasn't really addressing the issue. And finally, everything fell apart.
My depression was so deep, and the bulimia and everything, all those factors, I didn't date, those kind of factors put together. And we talked about family dynamics and how I didn't get along with my family, how I felt I never was good enough. And they said there had to be something more, that wasn't enough to cause the kind of problems that I had.
I had an eating disorder from about 8th grade on, and I had been dealing with the depression and the bulimia. And then about my freshman year in college that summer, I went to my mom and I told her that, I'm bulimic and I need to get some type of treatment.
Holly Ramona grew up in an upper-middle-class family in California, the eldest of 3. Her father, Gary, was a vineyard executive. Her mother was a housewife. With her 2 sisters, she had what seemed a privileged childhood: private lessons, trips, and exotic vacations. Before Holly asked her mother for help, life in the Ramona family seemed very good.
If you would have asked me that question 10 years ago, I would have said everything was perfect. We were the perfect family. I loved my husband. At that time, I thought he was a good father.
When Holly asked her mother for help, Stevie Ramona went to search for a therapist. She found a social worker by the name of March Isabella.
I went down to interview March Isabella and asked her what causes bulimia. And she told me many, many causes. And one of them was that 70 to 80% of sometimes eating disorders, there's molestation involved.
When Stephanie interviewed me, she kept asking me, well, why would my daughter have bulimia? And I said, well, there are many reasons, but I would need to see Holly. And she said, well, there must be some reason. And so I kind of gave her a profile. I said they're often caretakers and people pleasers. They're not in touch with their own feelings. It's not unusual that they're a parentified child. There's a high incidence of sexual abuse. In fact, I've read as high as 70 to 80%. In my own practice, I've seen 60 to 70%.
So I called March Isabella and I started therapy with her. And about 4 months into therapy, after I returned from being home for about a month, I started having flashbacks or memories of abuse that had occurred. And slowly I started disclosing them to my therapist.
When the memory came, I analyzed probably the first 3 memories, looking to see what they meant, because they weren't real extreme. It was my father was touching my leg, or as a little girl he was touching my leg all the way up to my thigh, and I felt frozen. I felt numb. I didn't like him doing that. It was a very strong reaction to something that could have been, Dad's just rubbing her legs are sore, or Dad's just tickling her. But it impacted her greatly. And then week after week, the progression of what had occurred had gotten a little more advanced. And I would listen, trying to assess, is this abuse? This is not abuse.
For a few months, Holly and her therapist sifted through Holly's past, searching for forgotten feelings and buried memories which would explain her depression and her bulimia. Finally, they say, they were both convinced Holly was sexually abused by her father.
In the beginning, when I started having them, I thought, maybe I'm going crazy, or am I just making this up? And then it progressed to the point where I went into the inpatient treatment, and I went under a sodium amytal procedure, and then the day after that, I confronted my father with the abuse.
I didn't understand what was going on. I mean, I was trying to understand what she was saying, and then I said, Holly, what are we talking about? What's going on? And she said, well, you raped me. And I said, Holly, this is not true. What is going on here?
It was too real. When I'd have a memory, I'd wake up sometimes terrified in the middle of the night, or there's some nights now I'll wake up huddled in the corner of my bed because I'm afraid that my father is there. And you can't have those things if it didn't really happen.
A mother has a gut feeling. First off, when your daughter comes to you, you have a gut feeling, and it's a strong, I don't care who it is, it's just something that you have, and then you go with the symptoms, and it just all comes together.
You said you were happy for 25 years, so where was your gut feeling?
Well, nobody said that, nobody told me that Gary had raped his daughter.
It became known as the Ramona case, dividing not only the family, but also further splitting the therapeutic community over the validity of recovered memory of sexual abuse.
If we take seriously our duty to our patients, then we are allies in their healing. And we are helping them to become more powerful, to become freer, to become more assertive, and to be in a psychological condition where they can, in fact, hold perpetrators accountable, where they're not intimidated and they're not afraid to tell the truth.
If you tell the truth about your life, you begin to see the world more clearly, and you have more power and more choice. You're more in charge of your life. If that truth happens to include that you were victimized, then tell that part of the truth. Because when you tell that part of the truth, then you can begin to change the effects that that had on you, and to realize that it didn't happen because of something you did, or because you were weird or unique, or because you were a bad person. It happened because we live in a culture in which violence is more acceptable than sex, and in which sexual violence is extraordinarily common.
Dr. Salvador Minuchin is an eminent psychiatrist who now works in the field of family therapy.
We need to be very, very clear that there are two issues. One is that at this point, at this historical point in the United States, we are discovering a tremendous amount of incest and sexual abuse. So we are not challenging that fact. What is important when we are discussing that issue is that therapists are creating, together with patients, memories that may be false. They may be false, but there is a sense in the part of the patient that they are real, because they are consensually validated. You and me agree. And there is this sense that if I defend myself against this past, then life will change.
But if Holly felt better after she confronted her father with her memories, he was devastated. Abandoned by his family and fired from his job, he decided to sue his daughter's therapist for malpractice.
Gary Ramona told a Napa jury today how he heard and found out that his daughter had accused him of rape.
Marge said that I would take Holly into our bedroom at night. I would close the door.
For the first time, the court would hear a malpractice suit in therapy brought by a non-patient, as Gary Ramona sued March Isabella and co-defendant Richard Rose for malpractice and implanting false memories of sexual abuse.
And I told her that it was absolutely a lie. It was not true.
Ramona asked for $8 million in damages.
We have the proof. We know you did this.
How does memory work? Can memories be lost and then retrieved?
It was very painful having those memories. I didn't want to have them. It made
Were
me
Holly's
feel
memories
gross
authentic,
and disgusting.
or were they implanted by her therapists? There were 44 witnesses and experts in a trial that lasted 8 weeks. Dr. Elizabeth Loftus testified for the plaintiff.
If there's no corroboration, you can't just know about the past by how someone remembers it, because false memories, when they're a product of suggestion, can be as detailed, they can be as vivid, they can be as confidently expressed, and there's no way for even the most sophisticated therapist, clairvoyant, anyone to tell the difference between a memory that is real and a memory that is a product of suggestion, unless you've got some corroboration.
She felt like someone was in the room and she was unsafe with that person.
March Isabella defended her therapeutic methods.
Flash of memory of her father in her doorway. And my note is she was probably molested and remembering the abuse.
I listened for the first 3 weeks, probably through about the first 3 or 4 memories, analyzing them, coming to a conclusion of, was she abused, or is this just some figment of her imagination? Is this a distorted memory process? Is this a very, very sick girl? And as she gave me more and more of what she was remembering and her reactions to what she was remembering, then I did come to a point where, yes, I believed that this had really occurred.
The jury deliberated for 16 hours. Then came the verdict. Gary Romano was awarded $500,000 in damages.
It is a mother's worst nightmare. He shouldn't have received a penny for raping his own daughter. And nobody gets it, and I hope someday you learn.
10 people can't tell me something that I know happened didn't happen. They weren't there and they didn't go through it. So he probably feels pretty good right now.
I lost my family. And I've been accused of something that's absolutely not true. I lost my career. I haven't seen my children in 4 years. What did I win? Tell me what I won. I was able to prove that the malpractice and negligence that was done to our family and our daughter, I was able to prove that they implanted and reinforced false memories. That was proven in court, clearly. But, that was court. Life goes on.
The verdict was seen as an enormous blow to the victims of repressed memories and their therapists.
Now that the jury has told the world that, maybe Holly's memories weren't true, that we can't really believe them, now other victims of sexual abuse are really questioning whether anybody will believe them.
If you don't want that to happen, if you don't want survivors to speak out, if you don't want them to tell the truth, if you don't want them to take you to court, then it's very advantageous not only to attack the credibility of survivors, but to attack anyone who helps them.
The debate is a century old and has its roots in Vienna, where Sigmund Freud lived and worked.
Well, Freud was really, in a sense, the first psychiatrist. And people were coming with their problems, with their unhappinesses. And he called what they were, quote, suffering from, hysteria. That is, they were suffering from, as he put it early on, reminiscences, ideas, memories. And what he was looking for then was, what were these memories? What were the ideas that were bothering primarily women? There were also men, but it was mainly women that Freud was seeing. And what he discovered, what he more or less stumbled on, at least as he tells the story, is that these women had been sexually abused in childhood. So he developed a theory that if somebody is sexually abused in childhood, they will develop later on in adulthood what he called a neurosis. But what we would today say is simply unhappiness. And he called it, sometimes this neurosis took the form of hysteria, and other times it took other forms, obsessional neurosis. But basically it was people were unhappy later in life, and Freud thought he found the reason for this, namely sexual abuse in childhood. So in 1896, he decided to present his new finding to the world. at what is by now a famous meeting in which Freud got up and he read a paper. Well, he didn't read it really. Freud was amazing at simply speaking. He just sat up, he just stood up and talked. And he called it the etiology of hysteria. That is, the origins of hysteria. So we would say today the origins of human unhappiness, really. So he read this paper, or he gave this paper, and he expected to be met with enormous applause, that people would recognize, oh my goodness, here is the first time that anybody has ever come up with a theory about what happens in childhood and what this leads to in later life. And instead of which, the people responded with total silence. And he had began on a very high note. He said, gentlemen, I am here to tell you that I have found the caput nili of psychopathology. I found the source of the Nile. I have taken this river to its bed, to where it really begins. It all begins in early childhood. It all begins with sexual abuse. And there was stony silence.
Freud was isolated. He had a new revolutionary theory for mankind which he called the seduction theory, which no one wanted to touch. He clung to the seduction theory, publicly at least, for a few years, then decided that his colleagues were right and that he had been wrong. His patients were not suffering from repressed memories of incest, but from repressed wishes for incest which came out as false memories, and which he, unwittingly, might have encouraged.
Clerk's office in the morning to pick up.
It took another 75 years before the women's movement challenged his decision. Sally Goldfarb is a law professor and an expert on women's rights and family law.
Probably get less press. When Sigmund Freud first put forward his view that a large number of women had been sexually abused by their fathers, he came in for a dreadful amount of criticism and very hostile reaction, and he then revised his view and decided that the women were making up their claims of child sex abuse, which went down much more easily with members of Viennese society because, frankly, it's a lot easier to think that women are hysterical and making things up than to recognize that men who are seemingly well-adjusted and successful members of the community might be perpetrating the most horrific and heinous acts against their own children.
Many people who would come to therapy claiming that they had been sexually abused were treated not as though it were reality, but again as though it were a fantasy or a wish on the part of the child. And that essentially caused a lot of disbelief, if not major disbelief, in incest from that time until probably the mid-1970s, late 1970s, when we had what's been called the age of rediscovery of incest.
One of the real criticisms of earlier generations of therapists was that they had not taken women seriously. Women would tell horrendous stories of things that happened to them and their families, to their doctors, to their psychiatrists, and they were put on Milltown, I think it was in the 50s, tranquilized. They were not taken seriously. So the next generation of daughters who, in a sense, were, I think, expressing the outrage, the unexpressed outrage of their mother's generation, as well as their own, demanded to be heard.
We have an incest survivors movement that has gone public. The taboo about talking about incest has largely broken down. Many survivors, including a lot of celebrities, have come forward and said this happened to them. And that is deeply upsetting to people who don't want to recognize that in our society there are a lot of sexual abusers, including people who we might think are very successful.
100 years later, we're back where we started. Freud started in 1896. It's just about 1996. We're back at the same place with one major difference. Freud was a lone, unique voice in the wilderness, crying out for a very brief period, terrible things happen to women. And they happen because of men, and we've got to think about it, we've got to stop it, we've got to do something about it. He was the only one, he was silenced, he lost up his courage, he went away and began psychoanalysis, which I think has been a misfortune for the world. Today, 100 years later, we have women who are saying, we will not be silenced about this.
Miss America 1958.
Well, one of the questions we're asking today is how can a person forget something so awful as abuse?
I was an incest victim from age 5 to age 18. Today I stand before you at age 54, an incest survivor.
Could something happen in your childhood that was so terrible that your mind locks it away? This woman says she was abused by a relative, but her mind blocked it out.
You know, when you remember, or at least when I remembered something like this, even though I had no prior knowledge, I knew immediately that this had happened.
And I trailed after my father because I immediately repressed all of his molestation and abuse, and my mother was off in her own world. So I was in the garage.
But just as in Freud's time, many therapists question the stories of repressed memories of sexual abuse.
I am not saying that there is no sexual abuse. I am not saying that there are no incest. I am saying that the therapy that says there is some place in the brain, a memory, that the memory is intact, and that if we move out the repression, the memory will appear, that is incorrect. There is no scientific evidence for this kind of thinking.
I personally have never met anyone who lied about being an incest victim or being an abuser of substances. I just never, no one would choose that way to go. So if you're saying to me, what do you think, what do you feel, do you believe her? The answer is, darn right I do.
Our program, Divided Memories, will continue after this short break. This is PBS, the public broadcast.